Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're looking at a situation in which Jesus was put on the spot by a scribe wanting to know which he thought was the greatest commandment. Before we begin looking at this, however, if you've not done so already, you may find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, and you can find the link to that in the video in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so then, without further ado, let's dive into this week's text, which comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, verses 34 through to 46. The action in this week's reading, and indeed for the past few readings we've been looking at, is set in what we now refer to as the Monday of Holy Week. So we find ourselves in the temple courtyard in Jerusalem. Jesus is surrounded by crowds who have gathered there to hear him teach. Yet he's also found himself drawn into conflict, initially with the chief priests and the elders, covering chapter 21 verse 23 all the way through to chapter 22 verse 14. He then had, as we heard last week in verses 15 to 22 of chapter 22, an encounter with the Pharisees and the Herodians who had teamed up to try and entrap him. Before then, in verses 23 through to 33, being confronted by some Sadducees who demanded to know his views about the resurrection. His final confrontation was with the Pharisees. It's a bit like they had one last throw of the dice, as it were. And it consists, today's passage, of two questions. One firstly laid at the door of Jesus by the Pharisees, and then a question that Jesus asked those who were troubling him. So in this passage, we've obviously got Jesus coming to the end, not just of his earthly ministry, but of his life. He knows what's going to happen to him in the coming days, but he's boldly teaching and preaching within the temple courtyard, still attempting to open people's eyes to the reality of the kingdom of God. We've got the vast crowds who we're told had gathered round Jesus to hear him preach. And we learnt in chapter 21 verse 46 that they regarded Jesus as a prophet. And that was the reason why the temple establishment, the chief priests and the elders, who were the first to have a go at him, had been unable to arrest Jesus. Now in this scene we've also got some of the Pharisees. Now the Pharisees were one of the major groups within the Judaism of the day, and they were regarded as having the gold standard for righteousness, for holiness, for commitment to God's law. And one of the number who'd come to confront Jesus was a scribe, which in that context basically means an expert in the law of Moses. Some translations refer to them as a lawyer. Now Matthew's Gospel was the second of the canonical Gospels to be written, probably around 75 to 80 of the Common Era. So after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70, which led to a lot of soul searching among God's people as to what was their identity about now the centre of their religious world had been destroyed. Matthew was also writing to a predominantly Jewish community, but one that was changing, one that was encountering Gentiles. So there's quite a mixed audience ready to hear this particular text. Now, if we're going to make sense of this gospel story of Jesus being immersed in conflict, there are some other passages that it's really helpful to keep in mind. We may wish to look, for example, at Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 to 9. That section is the source of what's called the Shema. It's the first of the commandments that Jesus quotes when he's asked the question by the lawyer. We may want to look at Leviticus chapter 19, verses 1 to 18, because it's in that section that we'll find the second commandment that Jesus quotes about loving our neighbour as ourselves. When Jesus asks the Pharisees a question, he quotes from Psalm 110, and you may find it useful to read that whole psalm, which is regarded as a psalm of David, who'd been the greatest king of the people of Israel. You may also wish to look at Mark chapter 12, verses 28 through to 34, where you'll find an earlier version of Jesus being asked about the greatest commandment. Now, in that equivalent text within Mark's Gospel, the scribe or lawyer who asked Jesus this question about the greatest commandment seems to have been sincere. But we know from verse 34 in today's reading that the Pharisees were seeking to entrap Jesus. So this was a trick question. This was all part of their plot against him. Even as asking a rabbi about the most important commandment was a fairly typical question. Nonetheless, we're quite clearly told they were looking to entrap Jesus. And there may be an echo of Psalm 2, verse 2 going on here. Verse 35 emphasises that the lawyer was seeking to test Jesus. But it's not quite clear, as I say, given this was a typical question to ask a rabbi, how good a test, as it were, this was. It feels like a last-ditch effort to try and catch Jesus out. In verse 35, the lawyer specifically adds the words, in the law, to emphasise that we're talking about the written law of Moses, not the oral law that the Pharisees considered particularly important in terms of how do you put the written law into practice, but which Jesus had roundly rejected. So that snippet kind of focuses the question, what bit of the law of Moses would Jesus choose as the most important? After all, there were 613 commandments in the law of Moses for Jesus to pick from. He gives a two-part answer to this question. The first commandment, as I say, comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and specifically verse 5. It forms part of the Shema, which was a prayer that the people of Israel would recite twice daily, and indeed Jewish people continue to do so to this day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. Now, as we read that, we need to keep in mind that the heart was understood as the seat of the will and the intellect in that culture. The soul was the centre of vitality, the centre of our life force, as it were, of our consciousness and emotions. And strength does denote physical strength, power and might. Matthew uses mind in his rendering of this quote from Deuteronomy, and he's the only one of the gospel writers to add that in, that sense that we need to put our intellect as well at the service of God. Love for God is not about nice fluffy feelings. It's about a disposition, it's about a way of life, it's a practical expression of love revealed in our words and actions. And if we look at the Greek, when Jesus makes this quote, he uses the word agape. And agape love is about practical love for others. Now, the second commandment, Jesus says, is like the first one, kind of implying they're two sides of the same coin. He quotes from Leviticus 19, specifically verse 18, and he shows that there is practical action to be taken in establishing social justice, and that is what it means to love God with all we've got. So, as I say, they're two sides of the same coin. I once heard it suggested that we can love God without loving our neighbour. Jesus here undermines that fundamentally, I think. So there is a social vision that's brought into view here, and it covers things that are emphasised again and again in chapter 22, picking up on themes from the Hebrew scriptures. Things like respect for parents and food provision for the poorest and for foreigners, about the need for honesty and integrity and not reviling people who happen to have disabilities or giving biased judgments, and certainly not seeking vengeance. All of this vision is brought into view by Jesus making this quotation. Now, when in verse 39, in the latter part of it, it talks about loving our neighbour as ourselves, this isn't about the sort of self-love that we've tended to associate with it in modern culture, so much as a kind of I am because we are, that Ubuntu idea that was very kind of central to the Hebrew mindset, albeit described in slightly different terms. I think we are called to recognise the depth of God's love for us, but the focus here is more on recognising that God loves me incredibly, but God also loves everybody else to the same extent. And so that then must govern how one behaves in relation to others, and indeed how the social systems that govern so much of our experiences of life ought to work. Now, Jesus wasn't unique in coupling these two commandments and joining with the term is like it in verse 39 in the first part of it. John Hull, in his commentary on this passage, emphasises the sense of these two commandments as being like two sides of the same coin. The first, the commandment to love God with all we've got, is like the vertical relationship. The command to love our neighbour as ourselves is like the horizontal, and the two meet in the same point in the middle. The two commandments, Jesus says, underpin all the law and the prophets. In verse 40, in other words, love is a lived faithfulness, an active compassion. It's not some kind of retreat from the world. And it draws together all those different strands of what was important to the life of God's people, particularly as they sought to wrestle with what's our identity post the destruction of the temple. The law of Moses, the teaching of the prophets that was so key, are all bound together, Jesus says, in this pairing of commandments. So that's the first part of today's reading, verses 34 through to 40. In verses 41 to 46, Jesus finally gets to turn the tables, as it were, and ask a question of his own. Now, in its original context, Jesus' quotation from the first verse of Psalm 110 comes in the midst of a Davidic psalm, a psalm of David that was celebrating a king's coronation. But it's used here to show that the Messiah, Jesus himself, was even greater than David, the greatest king of Israel. In this quotation, the Lord, Yahweh, is speaking to my Lord, the King, and that is a reference again to the Messiah. It was quite common in that culture for sons to refer to their father as my Lord, but it was not something that was generally done the other way round. And so when King David is pictured as saying that to the Messiah, it's implying that although the Messiah is a descendant of King David, the Messiah is indeed superior to David. While they recognise correctly, therefore, the Pharisees, that the Messiah is the son of David, they've yet to recognise the fullness of the one stood in front of them, who is indeed son of David, is the Messiah, but he's also so much more than they've understood. Indeed, they're looking at God in human form. In other words, their declaration is still inadequate. And we're told that they did not have a response to Jesus when he made this point to them. And while it might be a slightly confusing passage at first glance, you kind of look at it and think, what's going on here? when you kind of understand what Jesus was asserting about his character through this quotation, it's perhaps not surprising that we hear that the Pharisees decided, not being able to come up with an answer to Jesus, to walk away. But their doing so shuts down any possibility of further dialogue with him. So we have a lot to be thinking about here, particularly in the most famous section of this passage, the first part in verses 34 to 40, but also in the assertion of Jesus' identity that we find in verses 41 through to 46. With all of that buzzing around in our minds, we now turn to our questions for this week.